Barron Trump had never sought the spotlight at Stanford University, yet it found him anyway. With his tall, lean frame and quiet demeanor, he tended to slip into lecture halls unnoticed, just another student in a sea of intellectual ambition. But something about him stood out whenever he spoke. A calm, measured tone that made people stop and truly listen. On a cool afternoon, he made his way across the quad with his usual unhurried gait, weaving around chatting classmates and cyclists ringing their bells. Flyers for various events dotted the campus notice boards, but one in particular captured people's attention. Professor Samuel Mitchell Presence. The Fallacy of Faith. Why Religion Persists in a Scientific Age. Rumor had it that Mitchell, known to be a formidable philosophy professor with a flair for theatrical debate, would spend the session challenging students on the logic of believing in God, especially in a world brimming with technological and scientific advancements. Many students anticipated a spectacle. A few braced for it. Barron Trump, however, simply slipped through the large doors of Lecture Hall C, taking a seat near the back as he so often did. The hall itself rose in neat tiers, each row curving slightly to focus everyone's gaze on the podium where Professor Mitchell stood. Tall, silver-haired, and immaculately dressed in a tailored blazer, he exuded a confidence bordering on arrogance. The overhead lights illuminated him with an almost dramatic glow, like a spotlight on a performer waiting for his cue. A projector cast a big, bold title onto the screen: The Fallacy of Faith. Why Religion Persists in a Scientific Age. As the clock neared 2 in the afternoon, chatter among the roughly 100 students quieted. Mitchell cleared his throat, adjusted the microphone, and began his well-rehearsed opening. He greeted the gathering with a measured smile, his voice echoing across the hall. Welcome, everyone. I appreciate your attendance at what I consider to be one of the most important topics in modern philosophy. We've sequenced the human genome, harnessed nuclear energy, sent rovers to Mars, and built AI that might soon outthink us. Yet billions still pray to a deity they claim is all-loving, all-knowing, and all-powerful. Why does religion remain such a potent force in the 21st century? He swept his gaze over the audience, searching for reactions. Some students nodded, others averted their eyes, while a few, particularly those with strong religious convictions, already looked braced for a fight. Mitchell thrived on tension. He paced near the podium, throwing out provocative statements about the apparent contradiction between a good God and a world that seemed rife with suffering. Natural disasters, diseases, violence, injustice. If this God of love exists, he declared, why doesn't he eradicate evil? Why doesn't he show up and fix everything? His tone grew more theatrical, as though setting a trap for any devout soul bold enough to defend their faith. A few students, evidently atheists or agnostics, offered small smirks of approval. Others sank lower in their seats, wary of confrontation. Still, the professor wanted more than a silent crowd. Eyes roving, he searched for someone who might respond, and that's when his attention landed on Barron Trump. Barron, who had been quietly observing, caught Mitchell's inquisitive stare without flinching. The professor's lips curved into a half-grin that signaled a challenge. You in the back, yes, you with the composed demeanor. Tell me, do you believe in God? In an instant, the room felt charged. Barron Trump straightened in his seat. Yes, Professor, he said, voice even. That single sentence triggered the usual hush, the kind that often preceded Mitchell's most intense debates. Students craned their necks, whispering among themselves. The professor gave a triumphant nod. Now the show would begin. So, Mitchell continued, perhaps you can explain something that's always puzzled me. If God is omnipotent, how can he allow the innocent to suffer? How many children must die in floods, or families fall victim to random accidents, before your God steps in and does something? Or is this all part of some grand, incomprehensible plan? His words dripped with sarcasm. Barron Trump had anticipated the question. He folded his arms on the small flip-up desk attached to his seat, meeting Mitchell's eyes. It's not that I don't have an answer, he replied calmly. It's that I believe you're framing the question in a way that misses a key point. A handful of students blinked in surprise. Mitchell arched an eyebrow, encouraging Barron to continue. We ask, why doesn't God fix everything? But that implies he should control all outcomes and override our world's structure, including human agency. If people had zero power to make mistakes or commit wrongdoing, we'd be puppets, not free agents capable of moral choices. Mitchell smirked at what he called the free will defense, but Barron pressed on, explaining that not all suffering is human-caused. Some is due to natural disasters or diseases, which reflect a fragile but dynamic world. Prevent every harsh reality, Barron argued, and we'd lose the context that births empathy, resilience, and compassion. Suffering remains awful, but if we demanded God banish it entirely, we might also lose depth in our relationships, our growth, and our capacity for moral courage. The professor seized on natural disasters, using them as a prime example of meaningless suffering, and Barron acknowledged that a tsunami or an earthquake has no moral dimension in itself, unless, of course, one believes in a God who can guide how humans respond. Barron calmly suggested that real love, real empathy, and real heroism only manifest against the backdrop of genuine risk and adversity. Without that adversity, Barron reasoned, these virtues might never form in the first place. Now Mitchell switched tactics, critiquing the notion that religious believers claim a moral high ground. If moral values are truly objective, how do we explain the shifting moral landscape of history, like slavery or segregation, once widely accepted and now universally decried? If an entire society endorses slavery, Mitchell said, does that suddenly make it right? Obviously not, but how do we define objective morality, except by consensus or evolving social constructs? Barron saw an opportunity. He pointed out that if morality were purely by consensus, then yes, one would have to say slavery was moral when the majority endorsed it. But we recoil from that notion precisely because there's a deeper standard telling us it was always wrong, even if a culture failed to recognize it. That unchanging moral sense, Barron suggested, implies something beyond social utility. Maybe it points toward God. A brief murmur rippled through the hall. Some students cast uneasy glances at one another. Others leaned forward in genuine curiosity. Mitchell stood at the podium, tapping a pen against the surface as though choosing his next move. Then he turned his attention to the front row, where a young woman named Emily, known for her incisive questions, tentatively raised her hand. Barron, Emily said, I lost my cousin to a rare disease. She was only 14. That suffering wasn't anyone's fault. She didn't choose it, nor did anyone cause it. If God is loving, why wouldn't he stop something like that? Barron's gaze softened. He asked if Emily's loss had changed her perspective on life, on time, on how she cherished her loved ones. She nodded, admitting that she'd become more mindful, more appreciative of each moment. Barron gently explained that he didn't believe God willed her cousin's death, but that in a world where we truly experience love, loss becomes an inevitable risk. If all risk were removed, we might never see how precious life is or discover the depths of compassion we're capable of. An uneasy hush filled the room. No one wanted to trivialize death or heartbreak, yet many recognized the kernel of truth in Barron's words, that tragedy can awaken in us a deeper sense of love and purpose. Professor Mitchell cleared his throat, calling it a cosmic therapy justification, but Barron replied that it wasn't a neat justification. Suffering remains terrible. However, the capacity to grow in empathy and love, precisely because we face tragedies, might speak to a design where free creatures can choose hope and kindness in the face of pain. Sensing the momentum shift, Mitchell questioned whether altruism could be explained by evolution alone, a series of biochemical reactions that benefit group survival. Barron conceded that science explains some facets of altruism, but asked how that accounted for acts of moral heroism that defied personal or group interest, like risking one's life for a stranger. If morality were strictly about preserving our genes, how to explain someone who willingly lays down their life when no personal benefit exists? Or entire movements of social progress like abolishing slavery, led by individuals who stood against overwhelming odds. A student near Barron muttered something about faith always playing the same card. God of the gaps, but Barron shook his head, clarifying he wasn't saying, we can't explain it, so God must exist. Rather, he believed the persistent moral intuition many people share, even under different cultural contexts, was more consistent with the idea of a higher moral source than with pure social constructs. Mitchell rubbed the back of his neck. The trademark smirk he often wore during religious debates had faded to something more pensive. Hoping to regain control, he asked Barron if he could prove God's existence scientifically. Barron posed a counter-question. "Professor, do you love someone? Family? A partner? Anyone?" Mitchell stiffened, taken aback by the personal nature of it, but eventually answered that he did. Barron nodded. "Then scientifically prove it," he said. "Show me love in a beaker, measure it precisely under a microscope, weigh it on a scale. You can't. But you know it's real because you experience it, and it shapes how you live." Barron likened faith to that, an experiential recognition that shapes people's lives in transformative ways. Silence clung to the lecture hall, broken only by the distant hum of air conditioning. Some students stared at Barron with new respect. Others looked at Mitchell to see how he'd retort. But the professor didn't answer immediately. He glanced at the large clock on the wall and noticed that their scheduled time was nearly spent. Typically, at this point, Mitchell would deliver a sharp, concluding remark that left the believers in disarray. Yet on this day he hesitated. The usual script had been appended. A few seconds later, the bell rang in the hallway, signaling the end of the lecture. Chairs squeaked as students gathered their belongings, though many lingered, still caught in the debate's afterglow. Mitchell cleared his throat, announcing, "Class dismissed," in a voice lacking its usual triumphant edge. Even after his words, no one rushed to exit. They trickled out slowly, exchanging hushed commentary. Barron Trump rose from his seat, carefully tucking his notes into a worn leather folder. Emily gave him a small smile, gratitude mixed with lingering questions, and he offered her a nod, acknowledging that the conversation would likely continue outside these walls. When he reached the front of the hall, Professor Mitchell stood by the podium, gathering his own materials. The older man paused, then said in a low tone, "Barron, may I have a word?" Barron stepped aside so the few remaining students could pass. The professor studied him with an expression that was neither antagonistic nor smug, a rarity in Mitchell's lectures. He admitted he'd challenged many religious students, but rarely had someone engaged him calmly, with both philosophical reasoning and empathy. "You've given me, us, quite a bit to think about," Mitchell said. Barron simply replied that he appreciated the opportunity to share his perspective, that the goal wasn't to conquer or convert but to invite reflection. The professor nodded, seemingly unsettled yet curious. Outside, the sky had begun its slow transition to late afternoon, the sunlight casting a warm, golden hue on the sandstone architecture of Stanford's campus. Students who had been in Lecture Hall C swapped impressions of the class. Some insisted Mitchell was still right, that science and logic debunk any need for a deity. Others, more open-minded, suggested that Barron had raised thoughtful questions about morality, love, and the growth that suffering sometimes inspires. Emily, walking with a friend, admitted she still felt the ache of her cousin's death, but was somehow comforted by the idea that her grief could spark a greater appreciation for life. As for Barron, he strolled across the quad with a quiet sense of purpose, no trace of gloating on his face. He'd learned long ago that faith wasn't something you forced on anyone. Instead, it was often the product of reflection, of intangible inner wrestlings with life's beauty and pain, with moral convictions that transcended convenience, and with moments of empathy or heroism that defied purely material explanations. If anything, his role was to sow a seed, to make others consider that maybe, just maybe, there was more to existence than mere chance. Back in Lecture Hall C, Mitchell lingered, turning off the projector and stacking his lecture notes. The words, "the fallacy of faith," still glowed faintly on the screen. He ran a hand through his silver-streaked hair, recalling the discussion with Barron. Typically, he concluded these debates with absolute finality, but today he felt a disquieting mix of curiosity and doubt. He told himself he wasn't about to forsake his skepticism, but Barron's points about love, morality, and the interplay of pain and compassion echoed in his mind. With an uncharacteristically soft sigh, Mitchell switched off the lights and stepped out into the corridor, the faint murmur of departing students echoing along the hallway. In the days that followed, talk of the Barron Trump, Professor Mitchell debate spread around campus. Some rumored that Mitchell's edge had dulled, that he'd finally met a student who didn't cave under his relentless questioning. Others insisted he was merely letting Barron think he'd won, that in a future class, Mitchell would gather more data and strike back with renewed force. Yet, behind the scenes, a subtle transformation had occurred. At subsequent lectures, Mitchell brought a more nuanced approach to the question of religion, perhaps less scornful and more genuinely inquisitive. Emily and a few others found themselves pondering deeper philosophical and theological works, ranging from C.S. Lewis to modern apologists and critics of faith alike. For Barron Trump, life continued as usual, attending classes, turning in assignments, and catching up with friends. He didn't revel in any newfound fame, nor did he gloat. But he did notice a shift. Some students invited him to casual lunch discussions about morality or asked him about suffering and the existence of God. He answered politely, sometimes referencing philosophical thinkers, sometimes sharing personal reflections. He knew not everyone would agree, but that never seemed to be the point. The point was making people think, bridging the gap between pure skepticism and the sense that human life might hold a transcendent spark. Emily, meanwhile, confided in Barron that she couldn't shake the memory of her cousin, and she had begun volunteering at a pediatric ward in a nearby hospital. Partly, she said, to honor her cousin's memory by helping other families grappling with illness. She admitted she still felt angry, but that anger had softened into compassion for others in pain. In turn, Barron affirmed her empathy as a testament to the idea that heartbreak can indeed lead to love in action, even if the reasons behind tragedy remained mysterious. Rumor had it that Professor Mitchell spent more time in his office than usual, leafing through philosophical texts on moral objectivism and the problem of evil. Though some speculated he was simply preparing for another showdown, others sensed a genuine shift in him, a recognition that not all faith-based arguments were naive. Late one evening, a grad student claimed to have overheard Mitchell muttering about experiences that can't be measured in test tubes. One might guess Barron's analogy about love had taken root in the professor's mind, nudging him to consider aspects of the human experience that didn't neatly fit scientific frameworks. As the semester wound down, the mood in Mitchell's class changed. The debates weren't stifled, on the contrary, they were just as spirited, but they lacked the cutting hostility that once characterized them. Students felt freer to voice religious perspectives without fearing immediate ridicule. And interestingly, those who questioned faith did so with a level of respect not always seen before. Barron Trump, for his part, remained a quiet but steady presence, answering or asking questions only when he found it necessary. He wasn't trying to convert the masses. Rather, he viewed every discussion as a chance to explore truth, whether spiritual, moral, or scientific. On the final day of the course, the lecture hall saw one more lively exchange between Mitchell and his students, but this time it seemed more collaborative, less adversarial. At the end of class, as students packed their things, Mitchell made brief eye contact with Barron. They didn't speak. No dramatic exchange was needed, but in that moment, a mutual respect hung between them, an unspoken understanding that, through reasoned debate and honest dialogue, each had influenced the other's perspective in some measure. As Barron Trump walked out into the late afternoon sunshine, he reflected on how a single debate had rippled through so many corners of campus life. True, not everyone changed their minds, but that was never the goal. Faith, he believed, is not primarily about winning arguments. It's about being willing to see the world in a way that recognizes both its raw pain and its capacity for transcendent hope. He breathed in the cool breeze, thankful for the privilege of studying amid towering palm trees and sandy-hued walls, and thankful that perhaps, in that lecture hall, he'd sparked a question or two in hearts that might otherwise have been closed. And so the story of Barron Trump and Professor Samuel Mitchell's clash of ideas became something of a campus legend. A reminder that sometimes the fiercest debates yield not only sparks of conflict but also seeds of reflection that can linger and possibly grow long after the spotlight has faded.